morning, everyone. Look, on behalf of Zena, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. It's an absolute privilege to have someone the calibre of Dr. Zena O'Connor join us to share her wealth of knowledge on colour. As being one of only a handful of people in the world with this sort of PhD. A PhD obtained from the Sydney University School of Architecture based on colour and its application in the built environment. And this was after completing both a Bachelor and Masters in Design. And the timing couldn't be better for Zena, as this year we celebrate our 70th birthday. And a lot of our success and reputation has been built on our colour offer to the architectural market. So on behalf of Zena, I'd really like to thank you for your ongoing support, and I know you're going to get a lot out of this morning's lecture. So thank you very much.
Hello. Yes, please feel free to ask any questions, make any comments. I'm always open to not listening to my own voice. So yes, I'd like to thank both Rosine and also Architecture Now for this seminar series, which has taken me to Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, and now back to Auckland. Today I'll be presenting some evidence-based information. I'll just flick to our learning objectives for those of you that are doing this for your CPD points. I'll be talking about some of the attributes and categories of colour, and I'll be talking about the interface between colour and human response and the complexity of that. I'll also look at some of the diverse origins and beliefs that have come out of a lot of different areas and which have gone on to inform theories of colour, theories about colour psychology, theories about colour and the interface with human response. I'll be looking at some evidence-based information where you see authors' names in brackets throughout my presentation. They're not your typical fiction authors, they're in fact authors of research studies. So they're researchers from various universities and research institutes around the world who focus on colour in various contexts. So all of those references are references to research studies. I'll also be looking at some practical solutions for real problems that you may come across in applied design and the built environment. For those of you that saw Tuesday's, whoa, this happens on a frequent basis here. Okay, we're good. I'll make sure I keep it alive so it doesn't go to sleep. For those of you that saw Tuesday's seminar, there is a fair amount of overlap between today's seminar and Tuesday's. But moving on, the attributes of colour, I'm sure you know these. This is just a quick recap for you. But the attributes of colour include hue, which is the general category of colour, reds, blues, oranges, greens, and so on. It also includes tonal value, which is the lightness and darkness of a colour. And it also includes saturation, which is the intensity or purity of a colour. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that virtually all of the early research studies into the interface between colour and human response only focused on hue. They didn't focus on saturation or tone at all, and they didn't control in any way for saturation and control at all, which is a little bit problematic, as you'll see. There are 4 categories of colour. Again, you're probably very familiar with this. Conventional colour, which is, just the general groupings of colour, the reds and the oranges and the blues and so on. Then there's substance colour, and that's colour in the form of paints and pigments. Now, a lot of colour theories came out of or focused on that area of substance colour. They were colour theorists who really only delved into substance colour in the form of substance colour. Then there's formula colour, and formula colour obviously came out of substance colour, but it's colour in the form of various formulas, Racine formulas, Pantone codes, NCS codes, and so on. And the good thing about formula colour is that if you buy a particular colour from Racine, it has a very specific code, and that code enables the colour to be able to be recreated at any time in the future. So you buy a particular green, then in 10, 15, 20 years' time, you'll be able to go back and with confidence buy exactly the same green colour. Then the last category of colour is spectral profile colour, and that's colour in the form of light waves. And again, a lot of colour theorists focused only on colour in the form of light waves. So out of the various theories of colour, each of the colour theorists developed their own colour model. Funnily enough, in fact all of the colour theorists were males. I'm not exactly sure how or why that came about, but they were. I'll have to put up an O'Connor down here at some stage. But each colour theorist took it upon himself to develop his own colour model, colour wheel model. Amongst the first of these was Newton, and that's his colour model on the left-hand side there. He was very keen to turn his colour model into a circular format because he was very keen to sort of draw an analogy between not just music, but music of the spheres, so planetary action and all that, so the action of the planets, not planetary action. So hence he turned his colour model into a sphere, and most subsequent colour theorists did exactly the same thing. They created their own colour model and used a circular format, except for Albers. The two colour wheels on the far left-hand side, those of Newton and Herring, those two theorists looked at colour only in the form of light waves, and Herring in particular looked at colour in the form of colour perception. So his colour model actually depicts how the eye sees colour, if you like. It's a very simplistic depiction, of course, but he was one of the first to develop a theory of vision, and his theory of vision involved three opponent pairs: red-green, yellow-blue, which are the top and the bottom, red and green on left and right-hand side, and also white and black, or light and dark, rather. So his colour model basically depicts his theory of colour vision, if you like, and is quite different from the models on the other side of the screen. These other models by Harris and Chevreul and Ostwald and so on, they were all theorists who focused on colour in the form of substance colour, paints and pigments. So they literally painted up their own colour wheel models. And so hence, for those of you that remember using paints and pigments way back in the Dark Ages, you could quite easily mix basically any colour with a red, a yellow and a blue. And so hence their colour models tend to revolve around red, yellow and blue. They were their primary colours, whereas that wasn't the case for Herring and Newton. So you'll probably notice that these colour models vary considerably. There is no ideal perfect colour model. Itten's colour model is used quite extensively. He was a teacher and then a lecturer at the Bauhaus, so that was a very influential school. So his colour model tends to be seen around perhaps more than a lot of the other colour models. So in terms of the interface between colour and human response, it's actually a really complex interface. All of those magazines like, Women's Weekly and New Idea and whatnot would have you suggest that, we respond to colour on a universal basis en masse, and that's not really the case. That interface between colour and human response is in fact a very complex interface. It includes a whole heap of individual differences, not just age and gender, but things like memory, preference, perception, attention. The way that the brain works is that perception tends to, obviously we input visual material through our eyes, goes through to our brains, and perception and memory are all intermingled. So we'll be looking at a scene, and as we're looking at that scene, it'll be the information will be hooking into various areas of the brain, including memory and our sort of cognitive areas. So those individual differences also include mood, inclination at the time, as well as stimulus screening ability, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So some of the other factors that influence the interface between colour and human response include cultural differences, all of our culturally acquired beliefs about colour, and they of course vary from culture to culture, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit as well. And then there are contextual factors, so the context in which we see a colour will have an impact on how we interpret that colour. So context is actually very important. And not just context in a kind of a specific sense, but context in a more general sense. They say that, I came across a study just recently that suggests that music actually alters our perception of colour, which is quite an interesting idea. I haven't read through that study yet, but I'm looking forward to it. So perceptual factors also have an impact. They're perceptual factors like simultaneous contrast. For those of you that may not be familiar with that, that's where one colour will make another colour appear to change marginally. So, for example, you may have an orange against a green background, and the green background tends to make the orange look slightly redder than orange. So that's an effect called simultaneous contrast, and I'll show an example in the built environment of that a little bit later. And then there's also temporal factors, so that's in terms of prevailing trends, the changes in prevailing trends over time, as well as, you know, the fact that colour in any situation tends to fade or change due to weather and ageing. So moving on, in terms of human responses, again, there's a range of different human responses. There are the sort of more cognitive thinking type responses, evaluations, judgments, assessments, and so on. Then there are the affective ones, which are the sort of emotional reactions, the changes that colour may or may not have on us in terms of mood. Whoa, we're going back to sleep again. There's probably an easy way to get rid of that, but we'll just live with it. And I'll try and make sure the screen doesn't go to sleep. So there are the affective responses, our emotional reactions to colour. And then there are the behavioural responses, so the way that colour may or may not encourage behaviour, perhaps in terms of wayfinding or orientation within the built environment. So as you can see, that interface between colour and human response is in fact quite a complex interface. Women's Weekly, new idea, don't tend to go into this level of detail. So I thought I'd just very, very quickly talk about some of the diverse origins and ideas and beliefs that have fed into theories of colour and theories of colour psychology and the interface between colour and human behaviour. So these include correspondences, and I'll talk about those in a minute, some of the traditional New Age beliefs, and I'll talk about one in particular, some of the sort of pseudo-scientific theories, beliefs and basically opinions of some characters in the 19th and 20th centuries. Then I'll look at colour symbolism, because our beliefs about colour tend to mediate how we respond to colour. And then I'll look at some of the more robust, if you like, scientific research that's been done more recently. So correspondences. These are basically invented patterns of connection, and they date back to the ancient philosophers like Pythagoras and Heraclitus and Hippocrates, and they would try and sit about under their date palms or whatever. I don't mean to discredit them at all, but they would sit about and try and make sense of the world around them, the apparent chaos around them. And one thing that they often did way back then was to try and sort of find patterns of connection between elements and seasons and planets and colours and geometric shapes and so on. And it was one way of trying to sort of make some kind of order from what they saw around them. So they invented these patterns of connection, which are referred to as correspondences, and these are common in lots of other cultures as well. So for example, in Chinese culture there's the Wu Xing doctrine. It has a set of correspondences, and those correspondences underpin feng shui. You know, you might recall under feng shui there's north, south, east, west. There there's metal and wood, and there are seasons and so on. So it's a very similar idea, a set of correspondences that underpins a lot of beliefs. There are similar sets of correspondences in Arabic cultures and so on. So these correspondences were very, very popular right up to the Renaissance and beyond. This particular one by Nicoletto Rosex, he was a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci. And there have been some correspondences since. You might recall that Albers at the Bauhaus devised one that included certain shapes and certain colours. There's no real sort of evidence to sort of underpin these. They just seem to be a very handy way of trying to make sense of the world, if you like, to try and find patterns of connection, as we all sort of try to do. So in terms of traditional and New Age beliefs, quite a lot of the ideas from occultism, theosophy, mysticism and so on, spiritualism, auras and whatnot, found their way into theories of colour and beliefs about colour and beliefs about colour psychology and colour healing and so on. And one that I'll focus on today are the chakras. You're probably very familiar with a diagram like this. There are 7 chakras supposedly in different parts of the body. They channel the energy throughout the body apparently. And colour is often assigned to each of these particular chakras. Colours and chakras are frequently mentioned in terms of health and well-being and so on, and if you balance your chakras, you're in a good way. And it's often used in interior design as well, to some respect. But the interesting thing is that this idea of aligning colours with chakras isn't actually found in the original texts, the Upanishads. Yes, Hinduism is full of iconography and symbolism and so on, but this business of assigning colours to chakras isn't actually part of the original texts, from what I understand. It appears that the idea of assigning colours specifically to chakras was perhaps a Western invention by these 3 characters here. William Atkinson wrote under a large number of pseudonyms. Swami Panjadasi, Yogi Ramacharaka, the 3 initiates, and so on. Why he had to write under so many pseudonyms is beyond me, but it kind of smells a little bit dodgy to me. I don't know. John Woodroffe also talked about coloured chakras. He wrote under the pseudonym of Arthur Avalon, and Charles Leadbeater wrote about the chakras as well. Now, all 3 of these guys, they're American guys, all 3 of them were strongly influenced by Madame Blavatsky and theosophy and occultism and auras and whatnot. Now, Madame Blavatsky, I think, has got a lot to answer for in a way. She was very influential at the time. It's understood that she had that condition called synesthesia. And for those of you that haven't heard of this particular condition, it's a condition where the senses are intermingled in the mind, so that if you taste something, you also see a colour, or if you hear notes, you also see colours. Sounds like quite an amazing condition. So she apparently had this particular condition, and so it's no wonder that she could see auras. She was renowned for being able to see auras and read them, and therefore spiritually guide people. I think it served her well, and it served these guys particularly well, because they were all on the speaking circuit and writing books and making quite good money out of it. Hey, good luck to them. But this idea this is just one of the sort of traditional and New Age ideas that have sort of fed into theories about colour and colour psychology and the interface between colour and human response. And here are a couple of other guys whose ideas and opinions have also flowed into theories about colour. Many of these, in fact, I would say most of these weren't in fact evidence-based at all. Seth Pancoast was a general during the Civil War in America. After the Civil War ended, he went about growing tomatoes, and he changed the colour of the glass in his glass house to blues. And from there on in, he decided that blue actually helped produce more tomatoes. So he started this huge craze for red and blue glass, not just in glass houses, but in homes as well. And he suggested that by changing the colour of the glass in your sitting room or living room or whatever, and if you sat by it, it would help with a whole heap of ailments like exhaustion and whatnot. I'm sure if I just lay about in the sitting room reading, that would cure my exhaustion too. So he started this, one of the first viral phenomenons for blue glass way back then. Dinshah Gadiali was a very interesting character. He invented a spectrochrome machine, and along with that he invented or wrote an encyclopedia, and the encyclopedia is full of illustrations of different parts of the body and different ailments, and the idea being that if you channel sort of red to this particular area or blue to that particular area, you could cure, again, a whole list of ailments, toothache, baldness, and so on. Eventually the AMA hunted him down and discredited him, and he was fined a bucket load of money, and he was in fact jailed. Whoa, here we go again. Jailed for fraud. This will keep me awake. He was jailed for fraud. But curiously enough, his spectrochrome machine is still for sale, as is his encyclopedia. Go figure. Edwin Babbitt. Edwin Babbitt was another guy who invented his own device. He invented the chromo disc device, and again, if you shone light through it, certain colours would come onto different parts of the body. And again, he claimed it could cure a whole heap of ailments, from toothache, baldness, through to spiral meningitis and cancer. Really quite naughty of these guys. They were basically just feeding on the gullible, I think. He created a college, his own college. He created a course, a 3-month course. If you did the 3-month course, you were awarded with the title of doctor, which he awarded himself. Now, why didn't I think of that? Why did I do, 4 or 5 years at university? What a waste of time. I could have just awarded it to myself. Funny guy. Anyway, back in the days where, there were snake oil salesmen and charlatans and frauds, things are a little bit better policed these days in that respect. The next two guys, Goldstein and Gerard, are frequently mentioned in terms of colour and human response. But the interesting thing is that their studies weren't what we would call robust scientific studies by any definition. Goldstein worked in a sanatorium, never too sure which of those it is, sanatorium. Anyway, there were people staying there who were suffering from diseases of the central nervous system, which I think is just another way of saying breakdown, or they were suffering from schizophrenia and so on. And what he would do was he would visit with his patients and observe them. And if one particular patient was wearing a red dress and was particularly more active that day than the day before, he assigned that level of activity to the impact of the red dress. So his study was all about observations, but only of a very, very small number of participants, subjects, literally only about 4 or 5. Nowhere near representative of the population at large. Gerard is another gentleman whose PhD thesis was quoted quite widely, at least by Faber Biren, my last character down here. And Gerard did a study where he shone coloured light, red, green and blue coloured light, onto a bunch of male university students who weren't burning their couches. Have you seen that? Oh, down in Christchurch, I think. All the university students are in trouble for burning their couches. Hey, they've got to do something when they're not at class, I suppose. So anyway, Gerard used a bunch of male university students and shone lights on them and tested them for increased heartbeat and so on. And he came up with various findings, but what he did say was that he advised caution in terms of his findings. He said that his sample group was in fact a very small sample group. There weren't all that many controls. There weren't many controls from a sort of a scientific perspective, and that it probably was unwise to apply the findings from his study to other situations. So very good advice, very good caution, but unfortunately most people who quote Gerard don't also quote the caution that he advised. A lot of the studies at this time done by various researchers often used a very small sample of say, little chips, coloured chips, and then they'd take down the various responses by people and then suggest that, you know, the responses from their findings could be used for a whole gamut of different applications, which obviously is very unsound. If I'm looking at a bunch of chips, I might think, well, I like that red will look great as a dress, but then no, I wouldn't buy a car in that colour. So it's very unsound to sort of transfer the findings from one study to other contexts and other populations. So the last character I'll mention here is Faber-Biren. He was an incredibly successful colour consultant. He wrote a bucket load of books, one of which was called Colour Psychology and Colour Healing. He continues to be widely quoted today, which is all well and good, except for the fact that Faber-Biren didn't actually conduct any research himself. He quoted all of these other characters, but he didn't critically analyse what he read about Gattiali or what he read about Babbitt. He didn't sort of do anything deeper than just the surface, so to speak. So the fact that Gattiali was jailed for fraud, Biren didn't quite mention in his books, but he nevertheless quoted various claims that Gattiali made or Babbitt made about colour. So very naughty of Faber-Biren to do that, but he was an incredibly successful colour consultant, so he clearly needed to find evidence. He looked for and found evidence to support the various recommendations he was making to his huge firms that he was consulting to, like DuPont and the American military and so on. Good luck to him. He died a wealthy man. Perhaps I should go down his path instead. Quite a few of the theories about colour and human response also come out of art and design. There are various artists and designers who have come up with their own ideas about colour and how we respond to colour. There's one that I'd mention, Olafur Eliasson, who does a lot of installation work, and he's got some really interesting ideas about colour and human response that he builds into his installations. But going back in time, Vincent van Gogh had some very unique ideas about colour symbolism in particular. Very unique ideas. Yellow meant something, red meant something, red and green together meant something. And he usually painted these ideas into his artworks. But it turns out that he, more likely than not, had synesthesia as well. So more likely than not, he had that same condition where colours and tastes and sounds were all intermingled. So it's likely that he painted that into his very colourful works. Another chap who had some very firm ideas about colour and colour meaning and colour symbolism and so on was Joseph Albers, who of course was a student and then a professor at the Bauhaus. He He developed his own colour model, which was quite different from previous colour models, and he also grouped various colours and then assigned those groupings with specific meanings. So we've got lucid and melancholic and serious and serene and so on. So it's very hard to see or to understand the logic that he used to do this. It's hard to determine whether they're sort of valid or reliable, either in his day or even in ours. Okay, so moving on, that was just a quick snapshot of the various diverse origins and influences in terms of theories about colour and human response and so on. So I thought I'd talk now about the interface between colour and response and how highly complex it is, and look at some of the more evidence-based research. I was very lucky to get a copy of this extremely comprehensive review that was done for NASA by Wise and his colleagues. And it's very hard to get hold of this, but Wise was one of my PhD examiners and very kindly gave me a copy. But they conducted an extremely comprehensive review of all of the colour studies, all of the studies into colour and human response and environmental colour and so on, up to and including 1987, early 88. And they did this for NASA because, of course, NASA wanted to know what colours, whoa, here we go again, what colours to do the, what colours to do the interiors of the spacecraft. And that, of course, that's a very important point, because if you're going out into space, you don't want your spacemen to feel claustrophobic or homesick, although they probably will, but anyway. But what Wise and his colleagues found was that there were no hardwired linkages between colour and human response that occurred on a universal basis. They went through all of the studies, they compared the methodologies, they compared the findings, they summarised them all, and they found that there were no hardwired linkages between colour and human response. They did say, though, that it appears that personal beliefs about colour and personal beliefs about colour symbolism does play a role in how we may or may not react to colour. So their quote was, "One makes certain associations to colour, and these in turn may mediate physiological response." So that word "may" is a good one to keep in mind. We may or we may not respond to colour. We're all different like that. So in terms of colour beliefs about colour and colour symbolism, these do tend to influence the way that colour is used in applied design and the built environment. We tend to think in those sorts of terms. But it's good to remember that colour symbolism actually exists on 3 different levels. The first of these is an individual level. So on that individual level, our ideas about colour symbolism and colour meaning tends to vary considerably. It's highly personal. It might be that we love a particular shade of blue, and we love that blue because that was the colour of the shirt that, my husband was wearing when we first met. And we'll hold those sort of deep and meaningful ideas about colour often throughout our lives, unless we divorce the husband, which hasn't happened yet. It's close. Sorry, just checking that you're awake. So colour symbolism, colour meanings that occur on that individual level vary considerably and are highly, highly personal. Then colour symbolism exists on this cultural level, and they're all of the acquired colour meanings that we acquire through social, cultural conditioning and so on. Each culture varies in this respect, varies from culture to culture, from subculture to subculture. You might recall, during the 1960s, there were all the hippies, and of course they all wore something psychedelic. If you saw somebody in psychedelic colours, you knew immediately that they were part of that hippie subculture. If you see goths now, they wear black. So, you know immediately that they're part of that subculture. So all of these cultural ideas about colour vary considerably from subculture to subculture and from larger cultures to larger cultures. And then there's colour symbolism that exists on a universal basis. And there are, in fact, despite what the Women's Weekly and the New Ideas say, colour symbolism, there are very few examples that exist on this universal level. Very, very few. There might be red, red stop signs, red as a symbol for warning or whatever. You know, red, amber, yellow, green traffic lights. Very few examples of colour symbolism exist on this particular level. My apologies in advance for the difficulty of reading this particular slide, but there was no way to make it, to improve it. But what I'll do is I'll explain the slide. What it is that there are 10 rings. So imagine it's like a tree that you've chopped in half, and there are the 10 rings that go concentrically through it. So 10 rings, and those 10 rings represent different cultures. So we've got Western culture, we've got Chinese culture, we've got Southeast Asian culture and South American culture and so on. So the rings represent 10 different cultural groups. And then we've got the spokes, and the spokes represent colour meanings. So colour meanings like anger or fun or friendly or happy or so on. So those 84 spokes represent the different colour meanings. And what is very clear from this particular illustration is that there are patterns of difference rather than patterns of similarity. It is very difficult to see patterns of similarity. And that's the thing with culturally based colour symbolism. It varies considerably across different cultures. So if you wanted to know a little bit more about that, this particular reference from Aslam is a fabulous reference. What he did was he looked at anything that he could find about culturally based colour symbolism, and he summarised it for us, or rather he summarised it for the Journal of Marketing Communications. So of course advertisers and marketers need to know that they're selling the right colour. And this is the best reference that I've come across, that it's the most comprehensive reference in terms of culturally based colour symbolism. This is just a snapshot of the findings, but as you can see, if you look at any colour there, you can look at, say, blue. In Anglo-Saxon culture, some of the meanings include high quality, corporate, masculine and so on. But come over here to Southeast Asia and the meanings are quite different. It's cold and evil. Very, very different meanings there. The same with green, or any of those colours have quite different meanings, quite different colour symbolism across the various cultures. So if you need to know, are you doing your house in the right colour, are you doing the facade in the right colour, or the interior of the mosque in the right colour, this is a good reference to go to in that respect. So the other thing about colour symbolism is that it is highly context dependent. We always interpret colour depending on the context that we're seeing it in. So for example, red is a great example for this. Red can at once mean anger, danger, violence, death and so on, as you can see from the film posters where red is a feature. You automatically get the impression that, yep, this is, Psycho, it's about something kind of scary and horrible and maybe even a death involved. Same with Argo. There's automatically a level of fear aside from the fear in his eyes. With the pop of red that's used there. But red can also indicate sort of communism, socialism, revolutionary sort of ideology, and hence it's often used in flags and stars to sort of convey that level of symbolism. But red, of course, is also used to represent love and passion and virility as well. And it's used to convey those sorts of meanings in a lot of different contexts. And red is also often used to convey ideas like winning and competitive advantage and dominance and so on. And I can't go past this slide without mentioning George Clooney, who seems to sum up all of those things, to the women in the audience anyway. Okay, so moving on, in terms of evidence-based information about colour, one thing that I will mention is something called the fixational reflex. And as designers and architects, this is a really important thing to sort of know about, and you probably already know it anyway. But fixational reflex is basically the way that the eye moves and notices things. So we have these things called saccades, and saccades are these little micro movements that the eye makes. We make about 2 or 3, we all make these eye movements, 2 or 3 saccades per second as we're looking around a room or looking at a scene or even working. And so our eye is constantly, moving around and noticing things. And the things that a saccade will notice is movement. Immediately, movement will draw our attention. And a saccade will also notice very strong contrast, noticeable contrast. So that noticeable contrast might be a strong light-dark contrast, or it might be a strong colour contrast, or a strong saturation contrast, something that's very bright and saturated against a darker background. So in terms of applied design and the built environment, fixational reflex is actually called the isolation effect. You might have come across this already. And that's where strong colour and or light-dark contrast or saturation contrast is used to draw attention to particular design details. So we've got the bright green button on the website over on the left-hand side here, and that's the call to action button. So a call to action button can be any colour, it doesn't need to be red, it can be any colour so long as it's bright and contrasting relative to the background. And here is a product, a mix master type thingy, and red has been used to draw attention to the product controls on the side of it there. And then over here on the right hand side we've got typical office sort of environment, typical office interior, but it's a building where all of the lift lobbies are painted bright orange. So it's the isolation effect being applied to the built environment. Strong colour contrast draws our attention automatically to the lift lobby, and I suppose if you lived in Christchurch you'd need to want to get out pretty quickly, although you wouldn't use the lift, would you? But hopefully that'd be where the stairs are. So it's a really great effect to use when you really want to draw attention to exits or signage or whatever in applied design and the built environment. Now, the interesting thing about red is that, yes, red does have an attentional advantage. Visual search times are definitely faster for red than other colours, but of course, depending on contextual colour. Red definitely draws attention to the little flying thingy in the poster for the film Coherence. Red draws attention to the stairwell at the rear end of this hotel lobby, and it draws attention to the division between the tracks and the pathway, that sort of safety no-go zone in the underground station. So red definitely has an attentional advantage. A study that was done way back in 1983 by Belizzi and colleagues found that red and warm colours tends to attract people and draw them further into a retail environment or a restaurant environment. This particular study has been replicated quite a few times, and all of the subsequent studies, the findings from those, support the original study. So it was a very well done original study that's been supported and not disputed since. And so red has this capacity to attract attention and also draw people further in. So this is just a little bit of a side issue, but red apparently also acts like an aphrodisiac for men. Apparently women that wear red, it leads men to view them as being more attractive and desirable. I knew I should have worn red. So apparently red is as important as the waist to hips ratio and and facial symmetry. But apparently it doesn't actually account for, bad tempers or, or bad personality. Can't make up for that. But it does tend to act like a bit of an initial aphrodisiac for men, which is great news, hey, if ever I divorce that husband. And if you feel you don't look good in red, paint your bedroom red. Certainly very striking. Another interesting aspect about red is that Hill and Barton did a study of all of the teams of the 2004 Olympics and also the 2004 Euro soccer tournament. And they looked at all of the coloured jerseys that the teams wore, and they found that red is consistently associated with a higher probability of winning in sport. Why our dumb politicians were wearing blue ties is beyond me, but anyway, they clearly didn't come across this research. Elliot, some years later, suggested that perhaps viewing red on others tends to increase our appraisals of dominance, and that might account for why teams that wore red had a greater likelihood of winning. But the way that you could possibly translate that into applied design in the built environment is to use red. If you've got a new company or a company that's just rebranded themselves or whatever, encourage them to use red in their foyer areas to sort of help to convey that sense of winning and dominance in a subtle way, provided it doesn't clash with their logo colour. So you remember I mentioned that a lot of the early studies into colour only looked at hue, which was very remiss way back then, but they didn't know any better, I suppose. So some more recent studies have looked at colour, and they've found that it is in fact saturation and tonal value that determines whether colours are seen as being exciting or calming. And that, yes, saturation and tonal value in this respect tends to be more important than hue, which is, obviously it stands to reason. If you have a highly saturated yellow or a highly saturated blue, that is obviously going to sort of increase your interest, increase your sense of excitement perhaps about the place. It won't come across as being dull and bland and boring. And here's some highly saturated colours being used in the LinkedIn offices in New York City. So all of the lift lobbies are in this highly saturated blue. Some of the meeting areas are in highly saturated red. A lot of the work areas are in these more neutral whites, greys and blacks, but many of them will feature a saturated blue or a saturated red coloured wall. So saturation is correlated with arousal and dominance. And there's a very informative little video which it sort of explains the science behind this, if you like. I'll see if I can connect to it here. We might be able to do that quickly. No, maybe not. No, didn't think so. Anyway, if you just make a note of that YouTube URL, or just Google why do some colours make you feel emotions, and it goes into the science behind that. Give you a moment to make a note of that. Okay. So in terms of tonal value, again, tonal value, lightness, darkness, variations in lightness and darkness are correlated with pleasure and arousal. And the opposite of that, of course, is pleasure and sadness and arousal and calmness. So variations in light-dark contrast will lead to variations in ambience and also variations in terms of pleasure, arousal, sadness, and calmness, and so on. So, obviously, light-dark contrast is a major contributor to ambience, and Ando, of course, displays this to great effect in his buildings, and not to discount his work or diminish his work in any way, shape or form, but obviously lighting and paint colour can achieve very similar effects. Okay, so this issue of creating calm, a lot of clients want calm areas in their homes or a calm area at work to be able to work without interruption or whatever. So the idea about, the thing about creating calm is not so much about colour, choosing the right, here we go again, choosing the right blue. It's about addressing the problem of visual noise, and too much visual complexity, too much visual clutter does not lead to a calm space. So excessive use of contrast and visual clutter, the saccades, those movements of your eye, are constantly being drawn to competing areas in a room, constantly being hijacked, if you like, by those different areas of contrast. So over on the left-hand side, we've got this hotel in the south of France. It's got a beautiful view out to the Mediterranean, and it looks stunning. But the room is full of patterns, and those patterns are constantly drawing the eye to different elements within the room. Yes? The... Oh, okay. Oh, wow. And that's in the United Arab Emirates, yeah? I'll Google it, yeah. That sounds great. A good example for this. Yeah. It's interesting that, isn't it? You know, there'd be some cultures that probably love this level of busyness. But to our Western eye, we just find this level of complexity visual noise. To us, it's just visual noise. This particular interior by Branny and Desi, they didn't do the hotel, but they did do this interior here. I mean, it is so visually complex that it's almost impossible to kind of figure out what the room is. It is a restaurant, but it's kind of hard to find, you know, the tables and the chairs and so on, because your eye is constantly being hijacked to various areas in the room. So that level of visual clutter, visual noise, does have a potential for visual discomfort amongst some cultures, perhaps not others. And that, of course, will lead to cognitive dissonance, which isn't a calming situation at all. So, so to create calm, reduce the amount of strong contrast. Strong contrast in terms of light-dark contrast, strong contrast in terms of colour, strong colour contrasts, strong contrasts in saturation. The idea would be to use similarity of tone, not necessarily neutral colours, although these do feature neutral colours here, but not necessarily neutral colours, just similarity of tone, to try and minimise the level of strong contrasts and patterning and design details in a room. Obviously, design details and patterning do have a huge impact in whether your eye is being hijacked to over here and over here and over here and so on. So the idea for creating calm is reduce visual noise. And this is a job I did for a juvenile justice centre for some young women in Sydney. The brief was to create a calm interior for these, you know, agitated young women, to try and create some kind of homely ambience, and to differentiate between interior spaces and also try and reduce the institutionalised character of what was basically a jail for young women. So what we did was we used a range of different hues, but all in similar light tones. Any of the bolder colours that they may or may not have wanted, the girls could have introduced in terms of the posters and the doona covers and so on. But we tried to start with this sort of calm palette of similar tones. Different colours, but similar tones. Different colours we used to identify dining areas, staff areas, and so on. The green that you see there, the perimeter fence was a hideous light grey colour, but in front of the fence was planted some gum trees, and we tried to obscure the fence by painting the fence a gum tree green colour so that it wouldn't look quite so institutionalised with this hideous fence around it. So the idea in terms of trying to create a calm interior is to address the problem of visual noise. So moving on, it's been found that a moderate level of polychromy, multicolours, a moderate level of multicolours supports mood and well-being. Quite a few studies have been done in this respect. So if you have a client that wants to try and improve mood and perhaps productivity in the workplace, use a level of moderate polychromy in that interior. However, variations in this can occur because of stimulus screening ability, and also variations in preferences. And what that stimulus screening ability is we all tend to differ in how we respond to environmental stimuli. So some of us can sit about and read our Jane Austen novel with, the Foo Fighters blaring in the background, whereas other people can't bear noise while they're reading or studying and they must have perfect quiet. So that's an example of variations in stimulus screening ability. The same can be said for colours, visual details, design details in any interior. Some of us are good at just screening out those details. Other people will notice them and will be very attuned to them. Apparently Oscar Wilde on his deathbed said, either that wallpaper goes or I do. And there'd be a lot of people like that. They'll go into a room and they'll go, oh my God, I can't stand the red of the chairs. It's just hideous, I've got to go outside for a smoke or something. So, whereas other people won't even notice that at all. So that's that stimulus screening ability, and we all tend to vary in that respect. Kuller, Michaelides and Janssens looked at quite a lot of different colours in their studies with participants in real life-size built environment areas. And they found that, yes, red might be arousing, it might make people feel more alive or whatever, but it can also be associated with a level of anxiety. And the same with blue. They did this study a while back where there was that big thing that blue is calming and so on, but they actually found that for quite a few of their participants, blue was associated with depression. So, some people might find it calming, but then other people will find it quite depressing. So the idea is to use a level of moderate polychromy, to have a sort of a variety of different hues, which is exactly what the Royal Institute of British Architects have done in their new London offices. They have various meeting areas, the image on the far left of the screen, and they're painted in shades of greens and oranges and reds, quite strong colours, but plenty of whites surrounding that, so it's not as though the colour's like in your face. And then throughout the building they'll have these feature walls with moderately saturated blues and oranges and greens and so on. So there's this level of moderate polychromy throughout the entire office environment. And I just had to put in this image of Lego's foyer here with its fabulous bright yellow block-like area. Looks like a lot of fun. Okay, so you've probably come across clients for commercial interiors who are really concerned about attracting and keeping quality employees. This has become a mega thing in Australia, this idea of attracting and keeping quality staff. And basically what they're talking about is attracting and keeping millennials. Us older folk are sort of forgotten about. And I guess the reason for that is that by 2025, 75% of the workforce will be millennials. And that's that group, that generational cohort that's born between roughly about the mid-1980s and 2005. So they're slowly, they're making up the majority of the workforce. Whoa, here we go again. It does it of its own accord, no matter how many times I stroke it. Oh, it keeps us all awake. So the thing with millennials is that their preferred workplace design is this sort of hybrid of work and play. They like interiors to be cool and flexible and fun and kind of campus-like and colourful, obviously. As you can see from Google's Dublin office, which really does look very, very playful and fun and colourful. And also one of Facebook's offices here at Menlo Park with these bright orange meeting areas and then the sort of work areas on the left-hand side. The good thing about millennials and the good thing about interior designing for them is that whack up some Racine paint. You know, I know this sounds like a plug for Racine, and it is, I guess, but the thing is with millennials, okay, whack up a blue wall, 18 months, 12 months, 18 months later, change it to sort of lime green or change it to whatever colour, you know, Yeezy's shoes are or you know, keep them happy and change the paint colour fairly frequently. If it's going to be all about the millennials, go for it. So in terms of colour strategies to support or encourage creativity, this is another big theme in Australia and quite possibly here as well. You know, how to sort of design for creative workers. And basically the recommendations are to use a mix of moderately colourful spaces because those help to support mood and encourage well-being and so on. But also to have some blank canvas areas, some white, off-white areas, and plenty of window views as well, to sort of give a bit of a visual respite to those more colourful areas. Because obviously if you're a creative person, you know, you probably do a lot of your thinking looking out the window or just looking at a blank wall. And to minimise visual clutter and any unnecessary visual distractions in the creative environment so that they can focus on their work and focus on, you know, thinking through their work without being visually distracted. Most creative people are visual people, unlike, you know, musicians who are predominantly oral, but most creative people are visual. So if you make the environment too busy, they'll be easily visually distracted. Okay, moving on. So the thing about colour and both the exterior and the interior environment is that it definitely does humanise an environment. And in humanising an environment, it encourages engagement. And one of the earliest and very, very well-known examples is the Pompidou Centre in Paris. The aim of this particular building was to sort of try and break down that barrier that was quite common back then of the tension between the museum visitor and the very serious museum facade. We don't tend to have that problem anymore. Museums are designed in a completely different way now, thanks to these guys, basically. And what they did to address that tension between the museum visitor and the serious facade was they put all of the functional elements, all of the functional mechanical, electrical elements and whatnot on the outside of the building and colour-coded them, painted them in bright colours and colour-coded them. And that completely transformed the facade of the building, meeting their aim, which was to create happy buildings that people react to. And that was one of the first buildings that sort of applied this idea of using colour to humanise and encourage engagement. And this is another more recent example in a leisure centre for children in Paris. This building is colour-coded, and the colour coding flows through from the interior through to the exterior. So each of the areas is colour-coded in a certain colour, and that flows through to the outside, which is great, because if I'm the mum and I'm going to pick up Tommy and he's in the ping pong area, I know that's going to be the red area, and I just go straight there. But the other idea about using colour here is to make this an accessible place for children, a place that they want to go to, and also obviously a safe place for them too. So in terms of humanising and encouraging engagement, here are some examples, some very sort of extreme examples, if you like, by Jean Nouvel and some architects in Scandinavia, using very, very, very vivid facade colours. And the next time I come back to Auckland, I'd like to see this here. I'm sure it'll come. I'm sure it'll happen. But, you know, this is where colour is being used to really encourage engagement. You don't feel in any way overwhelmed or intimidated by these buildings at all. They don't have that sort of serious exterior at all. And here's another example of humanising and encouraging engagement, but in an industrial building. This is a Nestlé sort of lab, not what you'd expect of a Nestlé lab at all. It completely reimagines the idea of an industrial building. Those cut-out bits, they're in bright yellow, and that yellow flows through into the interior. Completely different approach to an industrial building. So super graphics can also transform perceptions of the built environment, and here's an example in a health centre in England. This is where super graphics are used to just paint various design elements onto the sides of the walls. These, of course, could be changed from time to time to freshen up the building. There's a childcare centre in Sydney that does exactly that. They've got super graphics throughout the entire childcare centre, and every 2 years or so they freshen it up with completely new set of super graphics. And here's another example in a school in an impoverished area of New York, where motivational slogans have been painted around the school. It's kind of a form of social engineering, if you like, in that the motivational slogans support the teaching policies and encourage the children, and, you know, quite a cool idea. And they look great from the outside as well. One of the earliest guys to do these super graphics was a guy called Jean-Philippe Lenclos, and this is a port building, a very boring average port building on a port, very, very boring. And what he did was he wrote the name of the port in very large letters. You can see the scale from down here. Very large letters and very highly saturated colours. And it just completely transformed what would have been a very ordinary industrial building, and probably an eyesore for the locals. And he did the same with this steel plant. He's done quite a few of these sorts of projects where he completely transforms it from a very boring looking industrial building to something completely different. Okay, so for those of you that saw this presentation earlier, just stay mum, but this is where, I'm talking now about disruptive colour, and this is where colour is being used to create a sort of a level of visual escape, a diversion, if you like, a disruption to the normal status quo in the built environment. It certainly can add novelty value, and I'll show you some more examples. And it can really reimagine sort of architectural archetypes, if you like. So here I've got 3 images of one particular building, super duper colourful. What do you think it might be? Is it an apartment building, nightclub, hotel, office? Anyone think it's an office? No? Shaking heads? Okay. It's got a pool for staff, so it's a pool for staff, a canteen for staff, and that's the foyer area. So, okay, put you out of your misery. It's actually the interior of Spiegel Publishing in Germany, and it was done, whoa, here we go again. It was done by Werner Panton back in 1969, and he specifically used disruptive colour and obviously patterning as well to as a diversion, as a visual holiday for the workers of Spiegel. So back then, of course, there were no computers, so all of the office workers dealt in hard copy, black and white text. The editors and the writers and so on, it was all black and white text, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. So he decided that they needed a holiday from that black and white, and hence he used these incredibly saturated colours and patterns, of course, as a diversion. It's quite clear that it is the late 1960s. But here's another example of disruptive colour in the built environment. You've probably all heard of drunk tank pink. There was a bit of a craze for a while there to paint jail cells in pink because Schaus back in 1979 did exactly that in a naval correctional facility. He painted the holding bay pink, and he suggested that there was a decrease in aggressive behaviour because of the pink, and so that was kind of copied around the world. But sometime later, Schaus and a couple of colleagues went back, and they found that it wasn't so much the pink that had an impact, but just simply colour intervention. The decrease in aggressive behaviour was an artefact of the colour intervention. So it could have in fact have been any colour. It could have been blue or green or stripes or dots or whatever. It just could have been anything. It was simply an artefact of that colour intervention. So it's basically an example of disruptive colour in a jail. So here's another example on a sort of slightly larger scale. This is a community pool area. It's got the playgrounds to the right-hand side, the pool, but this is actually an installation. Unfortunately, it's only temporary. The colours will fade. But what Hot Tea, or Eric Reiger as he's known, has done is he's painted the surround of it a rainbow colour. Really interesting approach. He's completely transformed the environment. He's completely disrupted what would ordinarily be just, boring old community pool and community playgrounds. So this photograph was taken from an apartment block looking down, and those apartment blocks would have this fabulous bit of bright colour to look at until the paint fades. And of course these particular buildings which I showed you earlier are also examples of disruptive colour in the urban landscape. This particular building on the right-hand side, Red House, in summer months it would be completely surrounded by green, and in winter months completely surrounded by white. So of course it would completely disrupt the environment, and it kind of echoes Richard Rogers' idea about caves and temples. A building can either be cave-like or temple-like. Cave-like in that it sort of melds into the surroundings, or temple-like in that it stands out of the surroundings. And each of these buildings tend to stand out from their surroundings due to the disruptive colours that have been used. And of course, Louis Barragan was one of the first to do this in terms of his use of colour. He often used colours that were reminiscent of his cultural heritage, and he'd paint walls or corridors incredibly saturated colour. So he also built these towers in one of the satellite cities. Again, it's just these very highly saturated pops of colour that help to disrupt the environment, if you like. And here's a really interesting example in Melbourne. It's underneath that facade, it's just a regular building, but they've used recycled panels. So the panels themselves are recycled. They're bits of panels, they're not squares or standard shapes, they're bits of panels, so they've clearly just been picked up and chopped and finished off and then painted and applied to the facade. So it creates this very unique kind of landmark facade, but just simply using coloured recycled panels. And again, it's applying this disruptive colour idea to architecture and to the urban landscape. Okay, so colour can also obviously be used as an orientation and wayfinding device. It's a very, very, very effective non-verbal mnemonic device in that respect. You know, where did I park the car? Oh, that's right, I parked it on the red level. Brilliant, brilliant way of using it as a wayfinding device. For parking stations, shopping malls. This idea in shopping malls of getting the customers confused and making them walk around here and walk around there, it just actually annoys shoppers. And I'm sure that shopping mall developers are starting to get that idea now. And they could probably use colour to help with orientation and wayfinding rather than hinder. So here is colour being used very, very effectively in Narita Airport. As you come out, I need to head to the train to get into the heart of the city. Okay, I just follow the red brick road, so to speak. Very simple but effective use of colour for wayfinding. And here's another example. Very interesting facade, rainbow-coloured facade of this airport. And that colour flows through to the interior as well. And in the interior, it acts as a very effective wayfinding device. You know, baggage claim is up the blue end and Air New Zealand is down the green end and so on. So a very, very effective wayfinding device. And here's colour being used for orientation and wayfinding on a much larger scale. Over on the left-hand side, we've got the Allianz football stadium in Munich, and it can glow a number of different colours, including red when the Bayern Munich team is playing, blue for when the 1860 Munich team is playing, and white for when the national team is playing. There's another football stadium that has glowing lights on the outside, and it glows according to the level of cheering that's happening in the stadium, which, according to how many lions are eating the... And there's also this large-scale housing project in Shanghai, where the roofs are colour-coded. But you can see from the scale of this particular housing project that they probably could have used colour a little bit more effectively, because if you live in the green roofed area, you know, you'd still have trouble finding your particular apartment, you know, if you're sort of driving past 10 of the same colour. I came across a housing complex in Turkey that uses colour way more effectively than this, and I'm just waiting to get the images from that, because colour is used extremely effectively in a very, very large housing project, so you can automatically spot your block in a much larger housing project. So behaviour modification, this is becoming very important, if you like, in commercial interiors. We're moving away from the boring old sort of blocks of tables and chairs and all in grey or blue or whatever. And the idea is to sort of design more collaborative, active areas, and to design completely different, quiet contemplation areas, and to use colour to identify each of those. So the idea in this approach is to use a range of mid-level saturated colours, so relatively saturated colours, to indicate different work teams. You know, I'm in the blue team and I'm over here, and the accounts team is red, and they're over there. And also to use colour to indicate different sort of social kitchen areas and so on. And then to use completely different palette for the quiet, contemplation areas. So that they're distinguished from the more active areas. So on the left-hand side is the Medibank Melbourne building. Hassel do this a lot in their new buildings. And over on the right-hand side is the Macquarie Bank building, where all of the meeting rooms are kind of colour-coded, so you know automatically, oh, that's the green room, that's the meeting room that I can use. Colour can obviously be used for wayfinding and behaviour modification, if you like, in places like hotels and office buildings. I've already talked about this example here on the right-hand side, where all of the lift lobbies are orange. So even the newbie, first day of work, knows exactly where the lift lobby is. And on the left-hand side is a hotel in Canberra, the East Hotel in Canberra. When you come up in the lift lobby is grey, the carpet is grey, the walls are grey. It's grey. If you come up after a couple of glasses of red wine after dinner and you can't quite read the sign because it's in minuscule writing, you really have no idea which way to go. So the recommendation was to colour code the lift lobbies so you always knew where the lift lobbies were, and to also use different colours at either end of the corridors. So as you came up in the lift, you knew automatically, yep, I'm the green end, I'll just go down the green end. So no matter how many glasses of red you had, you knew exactly where to go. Okay, so colour and light. Colour and light can certainly encourage engagement and also improve perceptions of safety. I'm sure you all know this. This is an installation by a studio in Holland. If you Google that particular studio, you can watch the video. I won't show it because it's in Dutch, and I don't know about you, but my Dutch is non-existent. But it's where these pulsating, glowing objects have been placed in an area that was otherwise a bit of a no-go area. It wasn't used, it was considered to be a little bit unsafe. But now, of course, with these glowing marbles, it encourages the children come and play, and they feel quite happy and safe being there. And it also casts light, and it completely enlivens what was otherwise a bit of a dead, unsafe area. And here's an example that hasn't come to fruition. It was done by the Designing Out Crime project team of the University of Technology in Sydney. And the idea was to use coloured light projections onto the laneway walls in an area of Sydney called King's Cross. King's Cross is a bit of a red light area. It's a bit of a, unsafe nightclub area, but it's also a residential area. It's a mix of the two, curiously enough. It's got a lot of lovely old apartment buildings. So to try and improve perceptions of safety in the back laneways and so on, the idea was to do these projections. It certainly would enliven the area. It hasn't come to fruition, but it is a project that could quite easily be done using, fluorescent paint that's also graffiti-resistant paint to just transform an area and improve perceptions of safety. So colour, moving on rather quickly, colour certainly influences perceptions of size. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Of course, Le Corbusier was onto this, and he suggested using different colours to break up a monolithic structure. Different colours, different design elements, and so on. And from the studies that I've done, colour very, very definitely influences perceptions of size. This is a project I worked on, which was a waste recycling centre, a very ugly building. The locals considered it an eyesore. it just sort of stuck on the side of a hill here in a kind of light khaki colour. And the idea was to basically colour camouflage it. And in colour camouflaging it, it helps to reduce the perception of its size and its bulk, and it also helps to reduce its eyesore factor. And for those of you that are really interested in fashion, and I can see that you probably all are, obviously research in this respect does certainly support anecdotal evidence in the fashion industry that size, darker clothing creates the impression of a smaller silhouette. Okay, another interesting aspect about colour, which I'm sure you're also familiar with, and there have been quite a lot of studies on this, is the difference between inherent colour, or the colour that is in the paint tin, and perceived colour. And I'm sure you've had clients who wanted a particular colour for their building. You do it for them, but they say it looks different. Why does it look different? And obviously variations in surface quality contribute to that, and also variations in ambient lighting. But one of the important things is that contextual colour plays a much greater role in this as well. So Anta has done quite a few studies in this respect, and she suggests that contextual colour plays a much greater role than normally thought. So this particular house is in fact painted a salmon colour, for want of a better term, but then of course it's completely surrounded by darker green trees, and those darker green trees set up an environmental simultaneous contrast effect in that they make the house appear much lighter than it actually is. So that's that difference between inherent colour and perceived colour. Okay, moving to children's hospitals and children's facilities. Children definitely have a much stronger preference for lighter, more saturated colours. There's no doubt about it, and that's why so many hospitals are now using those sorts of colours on their facades and in their interiors. They want to engage children. They don't want to scare them off. If a child has to go to hospital, you want to make it as pleasant an experience as possible and reduce their level of anxiety. And colour is one way of making a building seem more appealing from a child's perspective. It definitely kind of humanises and encourages engagement from that point of view. And here are some interiors where colour has been used to really brighten it up and encourage engagement and reduce anxiety for children. Children's colour preferences tend to vary according to, prevailing trends in terms of films and television programs and toys and so on. But that's a good thing. Just repaint it every 18 months or 2 years or so. Brighten it up for them. And here are some examination rooms, and they're not called bedrooms, are they, in hospital, but 2 rooms in hospitals, which are designed specifically for children to try and reduce their level of anxiety. Bright, cheerful images, bright, cheerful colours. Okay, in terms of children's daycare centres, colour is a really, really, really effective non-verbal way of guiding their behaviour. If you colour code the areas, they know exactly that the red area is the staff area, the blue area is the reading area, the green area is the play area, and so on. It helps the staff, it helps the children. They know exactly what is going on in each room. It's a very, very effective non-verbal orientation and wayfinding device. And some recommendations in terms of the colours for childcare centres. For those play areas, you want to ignite their imagination, so sure, use lots of saturated contrasting colours. In the dining areas, you might want to kind of minimise their excitement a bit. You don't want to start a food fight, so perhaps drop down the level of saturation and drop down the level of contrasts in the dining areas. And then in the reading areas, perhaps use slightly darker colours to differentiate that from the play areas and the dining areas. And then in terms of the sleeping areas where they go to have their afternoon nap, minimise the levels of contrast. So by minimising the level of contrast, you'll reduce the visual noise, and that in turn will help to sort of create a calmer atmosphere and help them to go off to sleep for their afternoon nap. So in terms of evidence-based information for healthcare environments, Schwartz and Toffel did, again, one of these very comprehensive reviews on colour in healthcare settings. They looked at all of the studies that had been done, and what they found was that the evidence is conflicting, anecdotal rather than evidence-based, and loosely tested, which creates a problem, because which way do you go? What do you do? And the other problem, of course, is this stimulus screening ability. Some of us are better at screening out certain colours than others. So previously, the idea was to use green because it was suggested that the green had stress-reducing effects, and to not use oranges and reds because they were aroused, they had arousing effects. But there are a couple of problems with that, and one is that we do have these differences in terms of stimulus screening ability. The other problem, of course, was that all white and green environments came to be very strongly associated with hospital environments. And so in time, the sort of connotations that came with those all white and green environments were that they were sterile and stark and clinical and inhospitable. And of course, the last thing you want in a hospital is for it to be or appear to be inhospitable. You don't want that at all. You want the patients to be happy, or at least feeling at ease. That white functionality, of course, can be kind of slated back to Florence Nightingale in a way, in that she was a great believer in things should be seen to be clean, things should be white, and hence the all-white interiors. Moving on to the green, supposedly stress-reducing interiors. So the idea now in healthcare environments is to use home-like colours. They'll help to minimise anxiety. You use colours that are similar to a home, it'll be more likely to create less levels of anxiety amongst the patients. Children obviously prefer the brighter, more saturated environments. Here's one of those machines that you lie on and you go into a full body scanner, but it's been designed specifically for children, and it just looks like some kind of fun place to go. Like, it doesn't make you feel anxious at all about lying on that thing and going into that machine. Older people prefer marginally more saturated colours and stronger contrast. And there's some sort of bad news about older people in that visual perception actually declines from about middle age onwards. So about half this room is already experiencing a level of visual decline in terms of sensitivity to light-dark contrast and sensitivity to colour. So not just for older people, but for middle-aged and older people, and also aged care environments, the idea would be to use strong contrasts so that it's easier to read the environment. It's easier to read the contour and the boundary between the wall and the floor, and the handrail and the wall, and so on. It's very, very important. And it's also very important for people with dementia and early onset Alzheimer's. They have great difficulty with spatial awareness. As the disease comes on, they literally have trouble putting something down unless there's a strong contrast. So if I had a grey phone and I'm putting it onto a grey table, I'd have trouble actually figuring out where the two are going to meet. It really is a problem. They have trouble finding a light switch that is white if it's placed on a white wall. That light switch over there is perfect. A white light switch on a dark wall. So there needs to be that level of contrast to help them literally read the environment, right down to things like a white toilet on a white floor. They have trouble figuring out where it is. So if you use a stronger level of contrast, they'll be able to read the environment much better. So the idea is to use strong contrast, 70% plus or more, between, steps and rises, between the leading edge. Oh, actually, I'll just go back. This stairwell here, I'll just talk about this stairwell. This stairwell is a brand new stairwell in the Apple store in Sydney. It is a soft grey glass, mottled glass, set in a stairwell that's painted soft grey. The stairs are lit from underneath, and I guarantee that everybody that walks down those steps has trouble identifying one step from the other. The stairs are almost illegible. And you see everybody that goes down those steps literally going over to the side and putting their hand on the handrail. They cannot find one step from the other. It's a brand new building. I'd like to talk to that architect. I have something to say to that person. It's a major problem. It looks cool. That's right. It looks cool. That's right. But that's like just dating Scarlett Johansson for her exterior and not worrying about what she's like in the inside. Aesthetics is one thing, but functionality is really important. And in her case, intelligence and personality. So the idea is to have a strong level of contrast. For the older people with Alzheimer's and early onset dementia, at least 70 plus. Between steps and rises, the leading edge of the step, contours and boundaries, railings, light switches and so on. It just helps them literally read their environment way better. I gave a seminar yesterday and somebody was telling me that her mother is in a retirement village, and the entire retirement village is just beige carpet, beige walls, beige doors, and when she visits, she finds it depressing. There's just no light and colour, but she notices that the older people that live there just hate it. They hate having to sort of find their way about. They can't literally read the environment. Somebody was telling me that in a retirement village they painted all the doors bright blue, and was it the bright blue that meant that there were less falls? And I said, well, it's probably not the bright blue, it's probably just the fact that the doors are now a contrast to the environment, so there are less falls around those doors because of that level of contrast. So yeah, strong contrast definitely supports legibility in terms of an environmental sense. So in terms of signage, for those of you that get down to that level in your projects, for older people and aged care environments, sans serif, use typefaces that have thick strokes, both vertical and horizontal strokes. Yep, they may not look as aesthetically pleasing or whatever, but they're more legible. If you use typefaces that have thick vertical strokes but thin horizontal strokes, the horizontal strokes can start to just disappear if you've got declining visual capacity, so a T will end up looking like an L. So yeah, sans serif, good strong thick strokes for the letters. In terms of text background colours, go for maximum contrast differential of at least 85% plus. So black on white, black on beige, black on light colours basically. You can see that there are quite a few colours combinations there that you cannot read at all. So a lot of the sort of greys on colour and whatnot, the text just disappears completely. So facade colour, moving on to facade colour. I've only got a couple more slides left now. Oh, here we go again. Whoopsie. Facade colour definitely contributes to a sense of place, and Lynch, of course, talked about that way back in the 1960s. And you can't imagine these sorts of places like the Cinque Terre area and Positano and so on with in bland colours. It's colour that makes those places, and it's colour that makes them memorable and gives them this sort of imageability that Lynch talked about, imageability. So moving on from that, heritage colours, I don't know about here in New Zealand, but certainly in Australia, we'll have planning policies that are very specific about the use of heritage colours. They frequently recommend that heritage colours must be used. But the downside of that is that you're fixing colours to a certain time and place. It doesn't allow for a level of flexibility there. And the new approach, of course, is to use a more evolving chromatic palette, continuity of palette, so that colours aren't fixed or frozen in time, but they're allowed to sort of connect the past to the present and the future to a certain extent. So one of the things that prompted my research way back was this particular headline on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald: strict rules to save the harbour. And it was all about new planning policies to save our beautiful harbour. The bit that I've got circled there said colour-coded buildings. All buildings were to be colour-coded. And it got even more specific. It said that the buildings had to be dark greens, mid-greys, but not dark browns. That's how specific it got. And I saw this headline and I thought, what are you going on about? This is just ridiculous. Does this mean that our opera house would go from white to mid-grey or dark green? I don't think so. It was just an astounding approach to planning, and it prompted my research way back then. And what I noticed about planning policy was that planning policy, as you probably have noticed yourselves, it's full of these terms, these very problematic terms like harmonious, sympathetic, compatible. Yeah, I know. I'd like to meet those planners too. And those terms, the problem is that A, they're not defined in planning policy. I can guarantee you won't find a definition of those. If you do, let me know. And B, they're actually not defined all that clearly in the literature on colour anyway. All of the colour theorists, sure, they had different ideas about colour harmony, but their various theories differed considerably. So, plus ideas about colour harmony tend to differ according to individual and cultural experiences as well. So this idea of colour harmony, sympathetic colours, there's 101 different definitions of these. Pardon me. And what I found from my research was that colour similarity does not necessarily equate with harmonious colours. And the line that you can't see, which appears to have disappeared off the face of the earth for some bizarre reason, but the line that you can't see there is that my research actually found that people prefer a level of contrast, that they like a level of contrast. According to those planning policies, these little buildings would have to be in greens or browns, but people actually preferred, the white one or even the pink one or even the blue little building. I used a large number of buildings and a large number of different colours, but people actually prefer a level of contrast between the building and its surrounds in terms of both the natural surroundings and the urban environment. So people do prefer a level of contrast. I think that was my last slide. Yes, it was. So there are some of my references. Don't hesitate to email me if you'd like any of them or all of them. And I'll leave you with this image, which is a rather beautiful photograph of Lithuanian garage doors in a whole range of different colours, and it's from a body of work called Beauty Remains. I just thought it was rather lovely image.